A few days ago, when I was in church, the congregation that I was a part of was singing a certain song that goes like this. So it got me thinking, what exactly does the word Calvary mean? Have you ever thought about it? It's one of those words that we use so often that we don't realize that we don't know what it means. So let's start by doing a search in the Bible. Is it even in the Bible? Yes, it is. But it depends on which Bible we're talking about. So in Luke 23:33, the scripture says, "And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him." So as you may know, this is talking about Jesus. They crucified him at the place called Calvary. What do you think this word means? And we're talking about Calvary, not cavalry. That's a different word. I'm sure you've heard this phrase, "the Calvary has arrived," in many films. We're not talking about that word. So what do you think Calvary means? Well, for one, the use of the word in Luke 23:33 is its only occurrence in the entire Bible. What makes it worse is the fact that most, if not all, modern English Bible versions do not use the words in their version of Luke. Why do you think this is the case? Let me give you a moment to think about it before I add my next point. So the name of the place that Jesus was crucified is called Calvary. That's if you're reading from the King James Version. The ESV, NIV, AMP, LEB, NET, NLT, MSG, and NRSV all render this word as the skull instead of Calvary. So what's so special about the King James Version? What does the original text say? In Greek, the word used here is kranion. I'm sure it sounds a lot like an English word we've heard before. Yes, it sounds like the word cranium, which means skull. That's where the word came from, actually. So why do we have Calvary? Did the King James translators drop the ball on this one? Well, no. They were simply following the traditions of the Latin Vulgate in how certain words were translated in the Bible. The Latin translation of the Bible was written by Jerome in 382 AD, and it became the go-to Bible for the next 1,000 years. This was before any English translations existed. If we go to Luke 23:33 in the Latin Vulgate, we would realize that the word used is Calvary. And using the power of Google Translate, we can find out what this Latin word means. There you go. So if you look at the other accounts of the crucifixion story from the other gospel writers, you realize that the word cranion is consistent in all accounts. The Latin Vulgate is also consistent in its use of Calvary, including the one in Luke. But the KJV uses Calvary in Luke and skull in the other Gospels. This is because the word is used as a proper name in the book of Luke, but it is used as a defining term in the other Gospels. What do I mean? If we read what it says in the book of Matthew, it goes like this. "And when they were come unto a place called Golgotha," that is to say, a place of a skull, "they crucified him." So Golgotha here is the proper name, and what follows after is the definition of the proper name. Golgotha is the Hebrew or Aramaic word for skull. But since the writer of Matthew, who wrote in Greek, transliterated the word Golgotha for the place name, the translators of the Latin and English followed suit by transliterating the word into English. Let me say it another way. The word for skull in Aramaic is Golgotha, or Golgolet, if you want to be very technical. But the word for skull in Greek is cranion, from where we get the word cranium. And the word for skull in Latin is Calvary. So an accurate way of interpreting Matthew 27:33 would be to say that when they were come into a place called skull, they crucified him. The reason the KJV translators didn't do this, in my opinion, was because the writer of Matthew, who wrote in Greek, didn't translate the original word Golgotha to its Greek counterpart, but instead he went further to explain what the word Golgotha meant, i.e. skull. So when Jerome translated the Greek New Testament into Latin, He followed this tradition of not translating the place name, but instead explaining what the word meant. The problem now is what happened in Luke 23:33. Why doesn't this follow the same formula as the other Gospels? Well, it's because Luke didn't transliterate the word for skull. He translated it. So Jesus was brought to a place called cranion in Greek, or Calvary in Latin. Remember when I told you that Latin was the go-to translation for over 1,000 years? Well, whenever there were pilgrims who traveled to Jerusalem to view the place where Jesus was crucified, they would have known the place as Calvary because they were native Latin speakers. This was what the place became known as, even in other countries that spoke different languages, because Latin, or should I say the Roman Empire, was that influential. When English began to finally develop as a language, Calvary was already established as the place name for the site of the crucifixion. Remember, the word literally means skull. So when the King James translators finally came to the scene, they inherited some proper names from the traditions that came about before them, one of which is the use of the word Golgotha as the place name in the book of Matthew, Mark, and John. But what they did differently in Luke was to transliterate the Latin word instead of translating it. So this is how we end up with the word Calvary. And this is actually not the only place they've done this. If I was to ask you what the name of Satan was, most of you would say his name is Lucifer. But this is a transliterated word that came out of the KJV tradition. You can learn more about it here. Calvary is used in many gospel hymns and sermons. There is nothing wrong with the word itself, but it cannot be found in any modern English translations of the Bible. That's because it's not a real English word. It's not because modern translations are evil. It's just that they have taken up the effort to help us better understand what is read. Most of us didn't know what the word meant, but presumed we did.